Hello everyone, this is GM Josh Friedel, and today I'll be doing the GM Choice lecture for the St. Louis Chess Club. And one of the things I love to do whenever a major tournament is going on is I'm always looking at the games. Every day I'm just trying to catch it. I love looking at new games, so it's definitely something I enjoy doing. And today the game that caught my eye in the Tata Steel tournament, which is the big international tournament going on in the Netherlands, is that the game between Nils Grandelius and Fabiano Caruana. And by the way, hey everyone, I am looking at the YouTube chat, so if you have questions or answers to the questions, I hate talking for just an hour. So I usually will be asking questions and having you guys answer. So I can definitely see the chat. Hey Tafina, how's it going? All right. So I'm actually wanting to do this game because I found it to be quite interesting. It wasn't one of the leaders. I would say that Fabi is having a really disastrous tournament by his standards. He lost a game because he basically hung a rook, which is kind of unheard of at that level. It happens once in a very long while, but it was kind of crazy. And so by his standards, he's not doing so great. And Grandelius is a really strong Swedish player, but he's struggling a ton. And it's kind of sad, like it's when strong players struggle, but in a tournament like this, which is brutal, it's sort of what happens. So I would say neither player is in form, but both players were definitely ready to fight, which I like. It was clear that neither player was satisfied with just, well, I'm having a bad tournament, let me just try to play safe. Both players played really exciting chess, and I thought that this game was very interesting. So without further ado, it was a French. So I've noticed that Fabi likes to play the French for a win when he's trying in a game where he really wants to be able to press. So we have an advanced French. C3, knight c6, knight f3. So here there are two main moves. There's queen b6 and bishop d7. I don't want to get into the theory too much. I have to say though, from a personal perspective, I always liked bishop d7 more because I feel like it's more flexible. Queen b6 puts more pressure on the center. At least immediately, but bishop d7 sometimes allows for rook c8 ideas, and you don't have to put your queen on b6, where sometimes, at least to me, it feels a little misplaced. So I personally like this bishop d7 move, but of course it's more taste than objective reality. So bishop e2, and this is a very common continuation. So both sides are developing logically. He puts the knight on g6. If you put it on f5, sometimes you're vulnerable to bishop coming back to d3 and hitting your knight. So bishop e3, bishop e7, knight bd2, castles, and rook e1. So we have a very standard position. White's basically playing in the center, playing all logical moves. Black is castled. So this position I found quite interesting. So this position, believe it or not, Fabi had in a previous game against Vaicha Legrave, I believe. And he actually won a really nice game by playing the move rook c8. And in that game, Vaicha Legrave played the move knight f1, cd4, cd4, knight b4, and black just got an excellent position. Knight c2 is a really, really annoying threat. He ended up playing bishop d3, but once you give up that bishop, you're really not playing for very much, and I think black's already better. But something very clever happened here. So typically when a player loses a game, they go over the game and they try to figure out what they did wrong. But sometimes when players win games, they don't do that as carefully. Top players, that's not true. And this is a really great lesson in that, because even though Fabi won this game, he looked at this game and he realized that maybe rook c8 runs into this move a3. And at the very least, this is very annoying, because now you can't play cd, cd. And your rook on c8 is not always that well placed. So he actually comes up with a very, very clever move, which is a5. And I don't know if this is preparation or if he just smelled a rat and kind of varied. But this is a very, very common technique, because you don't really want to walk into your opponent's preparation whenever you can, especially that kind of level of preparation. You're basically playing against the computer. You want to kind of throw the game off. And I personally really like this a5 move, because now you still have some of the same ideas, except you're more flexible. So for example, Grandelius plays a3. And now Fabi simply plays a4. And I really like this because I feel like he's gained queenside space, but he's flexible with his other pieces. He can still play for other things. But life continues here. Grandelius plays bishop d3, which makes sense. The bishop really doesn't belong on e2. The reason he develops it to e2 is to make development easier because he doesn't have to worry about his d4 pawn. So he puts it back on d3, where it's a lot better. Takes, takes. And here, I think that Fabi plays a really, really excellent move, but not, at least to my mind, not an obvious move. So I'm curious what you guys come up with. So what would you guys play as black here? So I'm seeing lots of suggestions. Moves like f6 and f5 I think are a bit too soon. So for example, if you play here immediately and I take, you kind of have an issue of, you have to worry about pieces landing like bishop g5. Like if rook takes, for example, I can play bishop g5 and trade off the bishops, which can be very, very annoying, amongst other things. But this in as itself would be kind of at least a little bit irritating for me. So I don't really love playing that immediately. Knight a5 is actually a very, very typical building move. But here I actually think it can get you into trouble. So knight a5 makes sense, right? You're trying to play b5, knight c4 and improve. But now white goes for this g3, h4 idea. And the problem you have is that if you allow h4, h5, your position is very, very bad. But if you play f5, for instance, I can take, so let's say you play rook takes once again. I play h4. And the problem now is that h5 is already very scary, and because your knight's on a5, if this happens, for example, I can actually just put my knight here, and already you're in huge trouble. If you try to take d takes, your king side's going to get wrecked with ideas like bishop moves queen c2 even, or queen g4 to g6. If you have to move your knight, the knight on e5 is great. So even though you played knight a5, you neglected the center. So it's very, very important that you always have your mind on your opponent's ideas. Because Fabi knew that knight a5 is a good move for him, but it also takes away control of the center, which makes f5 harder to play. So he plays a very, very clever move here, which is h6. This move looks a little bit strange, but the idea is it keeps pieces out of g5. And now, for example, if the move g3, f5, the situation's a lot better. Once again, you kind of want to take this. If you leave the pawn on f5, you're kind of blocked for a long time. So it takes, rook takes. And here, if a move like h4, he can simply play bishop d6, guarding e5, h5, knight g7. And notice how he has perfect control over here. There's no bishop g5, there's no knight g5. And the knight can come to f5 if necessary. So keeping the knight on c6 is very important to play against this idea. And this move h6, even though it looks a little strange, actually guards against this. So it's a really, really clever defensive move. But I think that it actually makes a lot of sense with f5, even though it loosens up this knight on g6. So here Grandelius plays queen e2. And in this position, I don't know that Fabi's move is the move I like best, but he played a very Fabi-style move. So I don't know if that's a hint for you guys, but see if you can figure out what he did or what you'd rather do here. So what would you guys do? Because Grandelius just played like, a normal building move. He didn't do anything too extravagant. So I really like Trent's idea of f5. And the idea is basically you're still forcing the capture pretty much. Rook takes f6, and you kind of play the way I suggested, with bishop d6 next, and then slowly build. And I think your position's fine. Like I think it's about equal, in that range. I do think queen e2 is a bit better than g3. I think it's more useful. I don't think the pawn on g3 is always so wonderful, depending on the situation. But in general, I'd say it's similar to the other position and you're doing fine. So this is kind of what I'd like to do. But when I say a Fabi style move, what I mean is it's a very ambitious move. It's a move that takes risk. Like he's definitely a player who's not risk averse. He's someone who doesn't mind, creating risk and playing a move that unbalances the position further. There are some players, and it doesn't even matter his situation, whether he needs to win the game or not. This is just how he likes to play. So what's a move that's more unbalanced? Rather than trying to play to secure the center, what's another way you can play that's really interesting? So I would say a move like bishop g5 you have to be very careful of because you're creating a very weak pawn structure. So after something like takes queen h5, I think you're experiencing lots of problems. Bishop takes g5 is happening, your knight is very loose. If you move the knight, you get mated, which would be quite embarrassing. So rook b8 I like the idea of, but it's not very Fabi style, it's very slow. b5 is the Fabi style move, which is what he played. So the whole idea of this is that he's expanding on the queen side. He's trying to play for b4. And he doesn't mind sacrificing a pawn. So if Grandelius were to take this pawn, his idea is actually very clever. He plays rook b8. And he's basically saying if you do nothing, he's actually threatening some tactics here. For example, knight takes e5 is a tactical shot. So let's just say rook c1, knight takes e5, and you're threatening this bishop. So you'd have to take and then knight takes back. And this pawn exchange is very, very good for you. Again, maybe he has crazy stuff like rook takes bishop, but probably just knight takes e5. And if white takes the pawn and he takes on b2, he has a position where he's down a pawn, but he has very active pieces, and this a pawn is kind of just weak. Like, this is one of those extra pawns. There are some positions where extra pawns are very meaningful. Here, I would say that the fact that black completely controls this side of the board means that the a pawn's actually not going to be that useful. So it's actually a really, really clever idea. Grandelius, on the other hand, does something which I think makes a lot of sense, which is that he basically ignores the pawn. He says, fine, I can't take the pawn. And now he plays queen b6, h4. So Grandelius is going for the attack, which makes a lot of sense. And this position, I think, is very, very tricky. So one of the main things is h5 is coming. So what piece do you think black wants to move in this position? What do you guys think? So bishop d8 is possible, but that's a very ugly move to have to play, right? So something like bishop d8, the problem here is that I think the knight on e7 is quite bad. And I'm also very unsure how you're going to battle against this idea. So I could play g4, g5, looks very strong. But I could also play bishop b1, queen d3, and I don't see how you're blocking this diagonal. If knight f5, I have g4. g6 is, of course, too horrible to contemplate, and I feel like you're just going to get butchered here. So this setup is not very harmonious. So what would be a better way to do it? Yeah, so we need to move the f8 rook so our knight can go to f8. There's a saying with a knight on f8 you can't get mated. This saying is patently false. You most certainly can get mated with the knight on f8. I've been mated with the knight on f8 way too many times. But I would say that it definitely helps in defense quite a bit. So here's the question. You guys both have the right idea. You want to bring the rook over, but do you want to bring it to c8 or b8? And in this case, I think the question is very complex. So I'm wearing a mask, by the way, so you guys know. I always get this question. There's usually someone else in the room, so it's not just me. I'm not protecting myself from you guys, believe it or not. All right. So which square? It actually is a very complicated question. And I actually think Fabi got it wrong. And I'm not blaming him because, first of all, I'm sure I'd get it wrong many times. But also, I think that it's a very subtle point. So you want the rook on the A file, so rather than playing rook C8, rook B8, you want rook FB8, so you keep the rook here. That's very logical, especially if you're playing for B4, because you want the rook guarding your A pawn. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is one where, to me, rook C8 is more intuitive, and that's what was played in the game, because you want your rook on this open file. Maybe it helps you play B4, knight takes. It just feels kind of nice, but there's an issue with it. So I think in the game, Grandelius played knight F1, which I actually don't like as much. But let me show you what happens if, let's say he played more aggressively. H5, knight F8, and now G4. What would you guys play here as black? Because I can tell you when I analyzed this game, I was extremely terrified here. Like, what are we doing? This G5 move is coming, and it will not be pleasant. So knight H7 I thought of, but the problem is now I just play king H1 followed by rook G1, and G5 is coming. Like, you're not stopping it. So I think that this is going to be really unpleasant. And queen D8, again, is a reasonable idea, but once I get a rook on G1, I'm going to be able to force through G5. There's no way you're going to stop me in any kind of long-term capacity. And the problem is this G5 moves come so fast, and there's no clear way to deal with it. So one move I looked at, for example, is knight A5, trying to play with the rook on the C file. But again, G5, and I just couldn't make this work. Knight takes G5. H6 is really deadly. There's like so many threats. So I thought you had to try to take this pawn, was the only try. But now white has a really excellent move. See if you guys find it. Believe it or not, I think it might be the only winning move. But it is a really, really strong move. So H6 looks natural. You have to be careful though. Moves like knight C4 threaten a lot of stuff. Even moves like F6 are possible, trying to get out of the attack. So like for example, if H6, I think F6 might be a slight issue. It doesn't look like an issue. It looks like an insane move. But how do you actually deal with it, right? If pawn takes, I don't think it's so easy. If you try to play knight F3, I can give a check on H4, which is a problem. So it's actually quite complicated. Bishop F6 looks like too much. I think I can take this bishop. And my queen can come back and defend. I don't know if you want to give up that much. Knight F3 makes sense, but again, queen G4 check. So the killer move, it turns out, is queen F3. So the main idea now is that you cover all these squares. So I'm just going to play H6 next, and you can't play F6. So the only try I saw was knight H7, but this does not end well. You play takes. And this is the key move. And again, I checked this with computers, so obviously it's not the easiest thing. But I think the key is you play this move. And the problem is this queen is not stable, and you have no moves. And next, I'm going to play H6. So for example, if knight C4, and this is, again, a long way down the road. Once again, I build my position with rook D3. And you actually just have no defense. H6 is coming, and you cannot stop it in any way, shape, or form. It's actually just really nasty. So even though you're up some material, you're going to be in huge trouble. Just to show you how it could go, let's say you play rook F8 to guard against the pawn. I play rook C3, and then H6. And the key is that my rook is very secure on this square. It doesn't hang. So let's say you try to play rook G8 to be able to take. I can take this pawn. Takes, queen H3 check, and then rook G3. And now I'm ready to play here. And this is going to be very, very bad. And yeah, exactly, Suzanne. The bishop on D7 is a really terrible piece. So obviously this is not a realistic, this is, I analyzed, I checked it with computer, but I was very curious why Grandelius didn't go for H5 G4 here. And I think it would have been very strong. After rook FB8, H5 is still a reasonable idea, but now black goes for B4, and with the rook and queen lined up, this idea is actually quite annoying. So for example, if white plays king H1, if you try to play G5 right away, I can take, and the whole point is that here, I take, queen takes, and because my knight's still on C6, your queen can't move to F3. I'm threatening this pawn. So you'd have to try something like this, but now I can grab this pawn even, with the idea that on takes, I can play the move f6, and I have a fork. Yeah, and the thing is, they didn't think so, because they have to just play this game over the board, which is really, really tough. When you're looking at it with analysis, like I did later, it's a lot easier, especially when you're curious about something and you always have the choice of turning on the engine, right? Like they don't have any of this. They have to figure all this out, which is really, really difficult, I would say. So g5 here doesn't quite work. So let's say after b4 they play the move king h1. Here I can actually play bishop c8, and this idea is really cool. You're aiming for bishop a6. And this is one of the keys of putting the rook on b8, that you have this bishop c8 to a6 idea, which is really, really difficult. And yeah, Matt, I would say that, at least from what I looked at, allowing g5 was really, really bad in that position. But here, for example, rook g1, bishop a6, you don't actually checkmate so easily. I can take here, and play takes, and queen b5. And your queen's getting chased around, and you're not going to have time to be able to checkmate me, especially without your light squared bishop. So a lot of different subtleties here, but I think rook fb8 actually would have been significantly stronger, but only because of this h5 g4 idea and this ability to play b4 followed by trading off this bishop on d3. So I was very curious myself, because it wasn't something that was intuitive. Like for me, rook fc8 makes a lot more sense, but I couldn't find anything against h5 g4. So sometimes you come up with ideas just based on necessity, just because h5 g4 was so strong. Instead, Grandelius played knight f2, f1, and this is a very typical Kingsidian attack, which is kind of like the opening he's playing. Idea of activating the knight via h2, g4. But in my opinion, at least, it's just too slow. And Fabi really showed this. He played b4, knight h2. Once again, probably wouldn't be my choice. I still would rather attack more directly with h5, g4, maybe knight g3. Rook ab8. But Grandelius does have a really clever idea. So once again, I kind of like g4, although with the knight on h2, it makes less sense, right? Like the knight looks weird, but the idea is you're going to play g5 followed by knight g4. But here, Fabi can take and play queen b2. And already he's creating some difficulties. The move queen f1 is possible, but now he can play rook b3. So he's threatening the bishop, he's threatening the pawn on a3. And this position, I think, is going to be very difficult. If he tries to play g5 now, I can take. So if knight takes g5, I can simply take on d4. So probably bishop takes is a bit better. But I can still take and play queen takes d4. And again, you're kind of collapsing a little bit. It's not so easy to hold this all together. So I don't think that this is really going to work out so easily for white. I think it's playable, but it's not so simple. So Grandelius plays knight g4. Fabi takes, plays queen b2. So here, I actually think queen f1 might be a slightly more accurate move, but it's a bit of a sad move to play. And it's not so obvious how it works. After queen b3, after rook b3, sorry, it looks like white's in huge trouble. But in fact, he can play this and take the rook. And then the idea is bishop d2. And the problem is the queen has to be on b2, where it's not so wonderful. I want to highlight it red, but it's not letting me. It's OK. In any case, the queen on b2 is actually a little bit misplaced. So it gives white some chances to get counterplay. But once again, this is not a very obvious continuation. He played the move knight d2, which I actually think is really clever. And it leads to some interesting play. So my first question is, do you think that Fabi can and should grab the pawn on d4? What do you guys think? That's very clever, Jimmy, but you have to be careful. After bishop takes, first of all, the queen hangs after knight takes d4, right? So you would and then lose. But if you would lose, why would you lose after knight takes d4? So let me put it on the board. Knight takes d4 is actually very, very bad for black. But the question is, why is it bad? Well, if you trade first and then sack on h6, I simply take, and I don't actually see where your follow-up is. My queen seems to cover most of your squares. So if that was your idea, I don't quite get it. So knight takes h6, I think, is a much more powerful move. So if I play king h8, you can take on f7 and move back. It doesn't help the situation at all. So let's say we take, then queen check. So probably bishop g5 is the best try, but it's still very, very sad after we trade and queen takes. But for example, if king h8, we don't even take the knight. We just take on h6, and your king is basically mated. So this would be a very, very sad way to lose the game. So instead, Fabi played a very, very important move here. So given that what we know about the position now, what do you think Fabi's important move is? Yeah, queen g4 is a key. That's what the whole idea of knight g4, right? I think that Grandelius played a slow idea, but it definitely has some poison once the knight gets to g4. So he puts the king on h8, which is really an important move. And I would say this phase of the game, Fabi played amazingly accurately. Like this was, even by his standards, I would say he must be happy with the way he played this part of the game, because it was really incredible how many accurate moves he had to play, because Grandelius's attack may have been a little unsound, but to prove it, you have to be so accurate. So Grandelius's first move was queen f3. And here I actually think it's not so difficult. What move do you think Fabi would play here? So knight d4, again, you have to be careful. Queen takes f7, allowing that move looks very, very dubious to me. So I think you're correct. Bishop e8 is a better move. So far, so good, right? Our bishop on e8 guards the f7 pawn. It kind of helps defend. But here, Grandelius throws us for another loop. He plays the move knight f6. And the ability to calculate and look at tactics accurately in a position like this is so important. And this is where you have to know what to do, because you can take lots of things or you can not take lots of things. But the ability to know what to take and not to panic is really tricky. So what do you think you should capture now, if you should capture anything as black? What do you do? Your opponent just plunked the knight on f6 and is laughing in your face. Well, not laughing so much, but it definitely looks very dangerous. So do you think you should take the knight? Do you think you should take the d4 pawn? Do you think you should take the a3 pawn? The ultimate obnoxious move. You guys have good intuition. Knight takes d4, it is definitely the time. If you try to take this knight, only awful things are coming your way. I mean, queen f4 takes the pawn, looks very strong, but probably simply I take this. And the problem is if bishop d6, queen g4, you cannot guard against g7. So this is a monumentally huge problem. So trying to take this pawn is going to only, take the knight, sorry, is only going to lead to sorrow. Taking with the bishop doesn't help you at all. And I don't think I have to tell you why takes on a3 isn't good. I mean, I think it's not good for several reasons. So he takes on d4. Thank you, Nils. So knight takes d4. And here Grandelius plays queen g4. And here, in my opinion, Fabi plays a very human move, which is probably the move I would choose as well. Or at least the main move I would look at. And it's a perfectly okay move. It's not the best move, though. So we'll see if you can find Fabi's move, but also see if you can, what other moves you can spot. Because this position is very complicated. Yeah, I definitely don't agree with knight f6. I think knight f6 is an excellent try. So first, guys, you have to ask yourself, what is Grandelius trying to threaten here? That's your first question. If you play knight c2, you walk into a very, very powerful threat that white had. What do you think that threat might be? Jimmy spots it. Bishop takes h6. This is a very, very sad way to lose a game, I think, because you can't take the bishop due to mate. And if you try to take the knight, for example, I probably just take this bishop. And even though your queen can come back, I don't know. I have some doubts about this position. Maybe this isn't even the most accurate way to do it. But like I can also threaten your queen first, right? Like in this position, I can play, for instance, rook a b1. I obviously didn't analyze this line, so I'm not 100% positive. But something like this first, now maybe take the rook and then maybe take. So the idea now is if you try to go for this, I can simply take your knight at the end of the line, although the bishop hangs, so maybe you have to do this first, or perhaps bishop f4 is very strong, trying to bring the bishop here. The rook hangs though, that's a problem, so maybe I have to go here. So this is what happens when you don't check a line in a really complicated game. But this looks very bad, because even if you bring the queen back, I can take and play h6, and I'm still crashing through over here. So I'm not exactly sure, but this looks very, very bad for black to me, or at least very dangerous. So I don't think trying to play with knight c2 is the best way here. So what else can you do? I will say, though, that you had the right idea with knight c2. Like, there's something very important that knight c2 did, which maybe didn't do it in the best way, but is one of the keys to this position. But I'm not totally sure. Knight c2, like, it's very close to working. So yeah, so knight f5 is what Fabi played, which is quite logical. Basically just trying to keep white preoccupied on the king side, like basically just defend the king side. And this is a very, very logical move. It basically kills a lot of the attack. It makes perfect sense. However, there was even a stronger move here, it turns out. And yes, Joe, this is a very head-hurty game. I will say that that's true. This is really complicated. And having to face an attack like this, one of the things I've found is that when you face like GMs of my level, like mid 2500s, say, attacks like this work out a lot because we're going to just mess them up. You'll get to checkmate us. Not always, of course. I'm not saying I'm going to get mated every time, but it happens. It can happen, right? You face an attack of this strength, you kind of collapse a little bit sometimes. When you face 2650s, less often. When you face people of Fabi's level, or 2750 plus, they defend so accurately that even if you have a promising attack, to actually finish it off is so difficult. So I found that, that's one of the things that makes those really strong 2700s so tough, is that they defend very accurately. So knight f5, again, is the safe move. Knight d7, I've heard suggestions for. I don't get how it stops. Well, first of all, I don't think it stops bishop takes d4. Oh, sorry, not bishop takes d4. I probably take the bishop first and then play queen takes d4. And I think that's just a piece, right? Because I'm guarding my knight and the queen with the bishop, right? And knight c8 threatens mate on g7, yeah? So I think the best one is actually knight c6, which again is a really tough move to play because you're walking into bishop takes h6. But the idea now is that after takes, you can take with the queen, and after bishop g5, you have queen d4. And the knight guards the queen exchange is really strong, so it turns out that black's doing quite well here. But it's not so easy to just play this way. And I think that Fabi just had his doubts, and I don't know what the time situation was or anything else, but knight f5 is just very safe. So he takes on e8, Grandelius does, rook takes e8, easy enough. Bishop takes f5 ef. So here, I think if Grandelius takes on a4, then something like knight e6, knight f3, I think the position is quite drawish. Even though the a3 pawn is likely to drop, I think it'll probably trade for the d5 pawn. And with 4 versus 4, I think a draw is by far the most likely result. I don't believe that Grandelius didn't see this, and this is much to his credit. I think that Grandelius was still trying to win. So rather than play for the drawish queen takes a4, and I think a draw would be very likely, he tried to win with queen takes f5. I don't know if it was the objectively correct decision, but I really have to give props. I think that a lot of people having a bad tournament facing the number 2 in the world, or maybe, I don't know what he is now exactly, but facing someone that strong would just take the drawish continuation. And Grandelius chose to take a risk. And I do think that by choosing to take a risk, even if you end up losing the game, you're learning a lot more from that game than you would if you just took the easy way out. That being said, objectively, you probably should take on a4. I think that it's just a little bit safer and better. He's number 4 now. That's very sad. He used to be 2,800 plus very consistently, but I'm sure he'll get back there. I have belief. In any case, so once again, I think that Fabi did find a very, very accurate continuation here, which was quite impressive. So what would you play as black? I actually didn't know Hikaru was playing the Grand Prix, like the slow tournaments, the Grand Prix, because from what I know, like Hikaru has been playing mostly rapid, not so much slow chess. I would say that in rapid, he's up there with anyone. Like I don't think anyone is a clear favorite over him necessarily. Maybe Carlsen, but in rapid, he's right up there, especially if it's online, just because he plays online all the time. I think that that's his best format. He's obviously an exceptional classical player, but I wouldn't say he's like, I don't think like the 2750 plus crowd or 2770 plus crowd, like if he's quite there with classical, but who knows? I mean, a lot of it is just because he doesn't play classical, not because he's not good at that format. So, but I didn't know he was actually playing Grand Prix. That's interesting news. But yeah, I would say that like he's perfectly capable of doing well at classical chess, but he just doesn't play very much of it these days. Bishop takes a3 is a bit of a risky move, I would say. Bishop takes a3, I think that this is the kind of thing that Grandelius was looking for, and maybe he takes on f7, for example. I think that your king is going to be in danger, and it's not so easy to move these pieces now as well. So I don't know that I love taking on a3. I think you have to be a bit more careful. King g8 is possible, but I would say that king g8 is also a very slow move. So it would give white the opportunity, for example, to play maybe rook b1, trying to do something there. Maybe play knight f3, trying to build his attack, or play bishop d4, try to solidify. I think king g8 is a little bit slow. f6 also looks just very loose and risky. Something like knight f3, again, I feel like with bishop d4 as an idea, I think it's going to be bad. Like, let me just show you. Like after this, I'm going to go here, and then this pawn is just really horribly weak. So I don't recommend playing this way either. So Jimmy's idea of d4 is correct. So the idea is that you're attacking the bishop, so it moves to f4. And at first, this looks like a perfectly fine square for the bishop. But Fabi's idea here was quite precise, which was knight e6, very good, man. And the idea is that now you're blockading this e-pawn, which makes the f4 bishop worse. And trying to take on f7 does not work so well. What do you guys think happens after it takes on f7? And once again, guys, I'm trying to read the chat and everything, but if I miss a suggestion or something like that, it's not a personal thing. I just don't always catch all of them. But yeah, knight takes f4. And the problem here is if I play queen takes f4, bishop g5 is just immensely strong, skewering the queen and knight. So rook a2 is probably a more clever move. But here I can still play queen c3. So if queen takes f4, there's still bishop g5. So probably you take this way. And now I can simply take on a3. And the problem is that white's king is really wide open. And these pieces are completely tied up. The knight can't move. The rook can't move. It's just a position where white's going to probably just suffer very badly here because his pieces are immobile. So rook a2 would have been very clever, but it still doesn't make this very good. The best continuation, I think, is actually rook eb1, queen c3, and then knight e4, because now you get a tempo on the queen. And I think here Grandelius has decent chances. Like after queen d3, it's still not simple because his knight's pinned. Thank goodness he didn't play king g8, right? Then knight f6 check would be available. But here, I think that it's about equal maybe, but it's very complicated still. But this is most likely what he should have gone for. He played knight e4 right away. And now knight takes f4, queen takes f4, and the move d3. So once again, I actually think that with careful play, Grandelius maybe would have some okay chances. But there are a couple more moments in this game. So what are the options that white has here? Like I do think that white's in some danger, but I think that he did have a way to try to play more aggressively. Actually, it is a common problem. The glass is getting fogged up. You have to kind of wear the mask and then put the glasses over, but it's not very stable all the time. So it is a common issue. So queen takes f7 I don't think works out so well. The main issue, I believe, might just be queen takes e5, because you don't have a great discovery with your knight. So because of that, you gave up your most dangerous pawn, which I think is not so great. Knight d6 is the move I worried about, and I originally thought when I was analyzing, because I always try to analyze on my own first, and then I use a computer to check how many zillions of mistakes I made. But in general, this is the kind of move which I wanted to play. d2, and then rook d1. And here, black actually has to find a very accurate move to maintain an advantage. Any guesses? So queen takes a1 is so tempting, right? But after rook takes a1, rook e1 check, I can play king g2, for example, and then take this pawn. And white's doing just fine here. I mean, probably we'll trade a pair of pawns. Maybe black has chances if they can take all these pawns off the board and have the two rooks against the queen, they have some chances. But it's actually really tough even there, because the pawn on h5 means this king is never safe. So if you always need a rook to guard your king, you're never going to win. So I don't think this is the most accurate. Queen e5 also I don't think works out, because I can trade and take on d2. And here white's definitely doing great. Yeah, taking on e1, Jimmy, would have helped you out a lot. Yeah, queen c2, I believe I can take this pawn. It's a really tricky move. It's again, it's not one I saw. So, and it's still not altogether obvious all the lines, but. It is indeed rook e2. And the idea is you keep the pawn defended. Moves like king f1 always run into queen b5 at least, or something like that. And after d7, you can simply play rook d8. And the idea is that in lines where you get to take, then sometimes queen takes a1, rook over, and takes will win, because you'll be able to take this pawn in time. So this turns out to be very, very strong for black, but still not easy. It's not like the game is over, right? It's just very, very promising. But I still liked knight d6. I thought that it was a good practical attempt. He played rook a d1 instead, bishop a3, knight d6, bishop d6. So he got kind of a worse version. But here, believe it or not, Fabi made maybe one of his big mistakes. This position, it looks at first like, black has the two passed pawns. It should be pretty simple. But it's still possible to play inaccurately here. And I think that here, and it's move 35, so I'd suspect time pressure was involved as well. But you have to be very careful. So black has quite a few moves at their disposal, but there's one move I really, really, really like. Very good. Yeah, queen b5 is an extremely strong move. So the whole idea is that you guard d7, you guard their pawn, and you're ready just to push your a pawn to victory. And this is just incredibly, incredibly strong. You can play b5 or d7, but for example, here I can still play rook d8 because my queen covers. You don't have rook e8, right? If rook e8, I can simply take. And I don't think you have any clever shenanigans here. So queen b5 is very strong, and if you try to take on f7, I can play d2 and queen e2, and this is going to be over. So kind of a clever move, this queen b5. I really like it just because it's such a multi-purpose queen move. The queen on b5, it attacks h5, but then it's almost irrelevant, right? You just want to queen your pawns. But good to notice that. I didn't even see it attacks h5. But the queen on b5 just kind of does everything in the world, you know? So instead he played queen c3. So my next question is, what could white do to try to draw? And what did Fabi blunder? What he blundered was actually not the least obvious thing in the world, but what do you think he blundered here? So d7 looks nice, but queen takes rook is a check, unfortunately. So that does not work. Yes, rook c1. And believe it or not, he's actually already, like, he clearly just had to have missed this move, because the problem now is that if he moves his queen somewhere, and I play d7 with rook c8 coming, I think he might lose. I don't think he's even drawing anymore. So this is a very big problem after rook c1. So he probably has to play d2. Maybe this was his plan, but after rook takes c3, rook d1, by the way, also probably is just a draw, right? Rook d8, queen takes d2. And I mean, okay, usually the way these endgames work is you play a3, and at some point you trade these two pawns. So say I go here, you probably go here, and then we agree to a draw at some point. So rook d1 would just draw very simply, but even rook takes c3, queens, king g2 should be fairly drawish as well. So rook c1, a simple move, and all of a sudden it doesn't look so good. This queen b5 move would have been really, really strong. And I would say that probably Fabi in good form would find a move like this more consistently, even in time pressure. But I think because he was struggling this tournament, because he hasn't been himself, even when he has a promising position, it's not so easy. But I would also say that missing rook c1 is very easy to do. But it's the kind of move you have to be careful of all the time. So he plays queen c3, but Grandelius also misses it. Again, I suspect both sides were in time pressure, or at least close. And after rook d1, queen c2, I think his position is not so great again. He plays queen d2, which doesn't really work out so well. Rook d2 was also possible. But here, black has a very, very nice continuation, if anyone would like to find it. It definitely can, James. Like when and it's also different, like when you're looking at it from an audience perspective like me, a lot of things might look more obvious or like, wait, why did they do this? But when the clock's ticking and you're sitting there on the board, it's a lot harder. So I always stress that, because when I'm pointing out mistakes, I'm not judging the players or saying, how could they do this? It's more just showing how decision-making works and how we can all try to improve on it, right? I'm not really going, oh, how could they miss this, I always like to point that out, because I end up, I try to point out when mistakes are made and stuff. Rook b2 looks very fancy, but I don't know if it's quite necessary. Remember, I'm 2 moves from queening, so you have to be a little careful. Rook b1 check is possible, and then the key here is that after king h2, you have the move queen c6, threatening mate on h1, so f3. And then what's the final move that really makes white's life miserable? The final nail in the coffin. So queen c1 is possible, but I think it might allow king h3, and I can try to run to safety. You have to be careful. I still have a very dangerous d-pawn. If you let my king run, it might not be so good. This is a more offense and defensive move. So don't just think offense. Queen c1 is just offense, but after king h3, maybe I survive. Queen c2, I might just push d7, right? Like I don't have to take you. I might take you first and push d7, actually. That's probably even easier. And now I think you're going to get mated first, unfortunately. So think offense and defense. Remember that queen b5 move, which defended and attacked at the same time? And be careful, guys. I am threatening rook takes d3 potentially here. And also queen takes f7. You want to prevent these moves. So queen d7 is more defensive. I can take your pawn. Think defensive and offensive. Where do queens love to be? Queen e8 is kind of clever, but I don't know if it ends the game or anything like that. I can maybe try queen e4, for example. I don't know. This d-pawn makes me nervous, you know? Queen d5. Very nice. I defend this guy. I attack this. So these are my defensive things. I'm attacking this. I'm attacking this. And you basically are done. Like, I'm just going to push this pawn. And that's going to be it. So the centralized queen, especially with few pieces left on the board, is just really, really, really strong. And this is definitely something to keep in mind. The queen on d5 would be very, very strong. So queen d2 was played. And how do you think Fabi finished the game here? Yep, he just pushes the pawn. And the two pawns are a bit too much. So d7. Are you able to play a2 or not? Don't allow b8 queen, guys. I guess you were saying rook b1 in the previous move. Rook b1 here probably does it. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with it. I guess I could check quickly. Yeah, completely winning. That would have worked too. He played a3, d7. Yeah, so rook b1 was very, very good. He chose something slightly different. So d7. Yeah, here rook b1 not so much because of d8, but he goes with a2. And this does the job, because now if you try to take in queen, I can simply take you and go king h7, and I have two pawns going. You can't get your rook to the first. If you could play rook e1, you might even be winning, but you can't stop both pawns from behind. That's kind of the problem. So a2 does the job. So Grandelius tried this, but Fabi simply offered the queen trade again, and here he can't avoid it because his rook's attacked. So a couple little cute moves just to guard their kings, but in the end, he simply goes for a winning rook endgame. Rook behind the pawn, and here he wins pretty easily because he just plays g6, for example, brings his king out. The king can run over here and try to take the pawn, but by then black will gobble things up. So for example, if king d2, I can play g6, for example. You can try this, but you're not going to really survive. Takes, and your king is way too far away. So the second you take, I can simply take and run my pawn. That's not necessarily a forced line, of course, but that's generally the gist of how you win a position like this. All right, thank you, Trent. I appreciate it. In any case, I thought it was a really, really nice game and really instructive, but just the complications and the way Fabi handled them, obviously there were some mistakes, but overall it was just very, very impressive how he kept his cool against a very strong attack and a very dangerous looking attack. And both players, I thought, played really interesting, enterprising chess. So I look forward to finding, checking out how the tournament finishes. And I'll probably be checking out more games and be going over more of them for St. Louis. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be here the next few weeks. So I hope you enjoy my lectures and have a good night, everyone. Or morning, wherever you are.